Black Cats Run podcast. I'm Tristan Black Ingersoll. This is Black Cats Run. Today's episode, red, yellow, green. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to let those of you know who have been maybe looking for more content on the podcast. I'm anticipating that there will be more over the next several months. As a teacher, I'm obviously subject to the energy demands of my profession, and additionally, some of the original structure that I had in mind in terms of having guests on the podcast just has not panned out the way that I had hoped, so I've been sort of restructuring and replanning my approach here. If you have any topics that you would like us to cover on the pod, feel free to let us know on the Instagram at Black Cats Run. Let's get into today's episode. The use of intervals in training is a separator between the recreational fitness people and the committed or the initiated. How do we know this is true? Well, because intervals are hard. They're a test, or at least we like to think they're a test of your mental and physical capacity to overcome adversity. We like to think that they demonstrate our ability to do what sport and training is all about. It's the most Icarus-esque thing you can do. You're pushing for this limit. You're embracing the risk of failure. You're demonstrating that you can, through an act of will, displace the possibility of failure. That failure is something that you can remove through the act of conscious focus, energy, engagement with a task or a challenge. And I think, and perhaps unsurprisingly that I would think this, that the concept of intervals, especially the social constructs that have been built up and then reinforced, matter significantly when we try to understand them. I think that those constructs speak in large part to the way in which, in our desire to demonstrate to ourselves, and for some of us to demonstrate to others, that we have elevated ourselves above a more crass existence. And in that process, we have moved to that plane of the elite existence of athlete. And in doing so, we tend to reinforce and perpetuate a series of norms that exist around the cult of the interval. And doing that might give sort of a more maybe transient kind of social reward, but ultimately, in so doing, we consequence ourselves, because all we ever are really accomplishing is taking away from the more substantive, transformative reward, the reward of actual improvement. So, what do we think we need to know about intervals, and what should we know instead? A good starting place is really the starting place. You know, your earliest experience with training for sports. What was that? How did that engage you? And obviously there can't be right or wrong answers to that, and I'm not trying to insinuate or suggest that there are. But I think that people enter into this space as a neophyte. As much as I think some of the structures of initiation and separation are problematic and limiting in terms of what the kind of outcomes of experience that we ultimately, I guess, access through engaging with sport can be, I think it's also true that there is going to inevitably be some sort of transition from a state of ignorance to a state of at least presumed knowledge. And then, I think one of the conceits of this podcast is that you don't really have this A to B process where you go from being outsider to insider, and then that's all there is. I think that there necessarily should be a continuing exploration. And I think that's not just for social and cultural reasons. I also think that's very much the case because of, the limited extent to which we really understand in terms of the sort of more tangible, I suppose you could say, scientific effects of training. Except I think scientific, when we say scientific in terms of training, a lot of times people ultimately take that to mean that, we're talking about, or we're referring to simply a set of, definable biochemical cellular level concepts. And I think that's been kind of an unfortunate narrowing of that value, right? But really we're talking about is that, training is a real thing because it leads to real results. Even if sometimes those interventions may be somewhat placebo or nocebo-esque in nature. And I think that question, though, of when we engage in training, it's an act of performance. Who are we performing for? And for me, my perspective has always been by default that I'm really ultimately doing this for myself. And I'm perfectly happy to admit that being acknowledged or appreciated by other people can be a positive, nice thing. But if I've done a race, or I guess now right with Strava, our training is so much more visible than it used to be before platforms and spaces like that. If I do a training activity, training session, and I sort of get some sort of positive feedback, or I guess in the case of Strava, literal kudos from other people, if I don't first feel like good about what I did, and I don't feel that it meets my kind of internal standard or framework of performance, then, it doesn't really elevate my experience. But I think that for other people, it's a very different thing, and it's much more external. How can I be perceived in this space? And, the idea of being an athlete, is that something that has expanded as a kind of a concept of a role or identity? And is that a result of, the ways in which we have created opportunities to project these kinds of identities? I mean, historically, it seems to be the case that identities develop in culture is commensurate to the ability for those identities to be expressed and, recognized. And the more recognition there is, the more likely people are to build into those identities. And that's caused an expansion of what that means for people of a certain level of affluence or leisure time. Who and how do they want to be seen as? And I think, obviously the internet and the ways in which we've created social spaces using the internet has had a huge impact on that. And therefore, when we go to do training and engage in the practice of being an athlete, it becomes something that is not, well, in this particular time of the day, I'm doing this activity. To be honest, I don't consider myself a runner. I would feel very awkward telling somebody I'm a runner, I'm a cyclist. I guess I recognize that I am, by consequence of the things that I do with my time, I am in some extent an athlete, but I haven't thought about, how can I cultivate that or project that? But it's certainly true that that's a reflection of my more sort of internal perspective on this stuff, is I want to feel kind of those internal rewards of competence. I want to feel, achieving. And I especially like to feel the, very tangible, real athletic experience of feeling powerful and controlled and strong, overcoming something that's challenging, right? And especially that, really elevating feeling that can come with being fast. But For other people, I think that's not necessarily true. I think that the perspective of others or outsiders is a huge factor that drives what they do, how they present, how they dress, the values that they claim to have, I think are oftentimes extremely malleable and are very much subject to what they perceive others to have value for. And I think this kind of behavior has a significant consequence on the nature of interval training, because interval training is probably the most badge value-esque thing that you can do as an athlete to try to demonstrate your worth. And I would argue it has greater badge value than, your volume of training, because I think that people are much more conflicted and, unhappy with volume of training. And to the extent where in some contexts, I think it's sort of been presented almost as a perception that it's like a kind of cheating in a way that, well, you do all this volume and you do well, but that in a sense somehow invalidates that because you're not actually naturally talented or gifted, but you're just sort of, forcing your way by brute force to the top by doing all of this volume of work, which is, the reality is that's an idiotic attitude to have, because the purpose of this stuff is to find a way to practice at it so that you improve. And if you're getting improvements, then what you're doing is clearly working to some degree, or else there wouldn't be any improvements to refer to. But with intervals, I think that people very much can see that as this real kind of like social badge, social achievement. And I think that's where you see it as a dividing line between people who sort of do fitness activities versus people who really want to buy into that. And it's like, by you're sort of like giving your pound of flesh out through, executing these intervals, which are these, by almost every established norm, a very challenging, hard thing to do, which requires a certain kind of environment, a certain kind of mental energy. They're generally very unsustainable over longer periods of time without significant support or intervention to keep people engaged with it. And even then, I think the attritional rate is basically unacceptable from a coaching perspective and from a athlete perspective. But if you can sort of do this stuff, people will project this. And a lot of the stuff you see in the kind of new spaces of where people show themselves being an athlete are, representations of intensity. And even in the context of people just like, oh, I'm just running. And it's like, it would be cool to find a way to evaluate and say, okay, the average running content creator, how fast are they running for their content? Sort of represented as, well, here I am just out for my run. And, what are they? It seems like they're all running at least 5-minute pace. And it's like, nobody runs like that. And then you get into you can go to the next level of the people with these kind of like ridiculously, overly contrived, choreographed, patterns of movement. And anybody who's been around running or cycling and swimming, whatever, you can tell the difference between what's authentic and what's staged. But the staged has been normalized. And I think intervals are something that, because of their value as this sort of like brand, in the sense of like an iron brand, that you are sort of stamping yourself with the authority of that brand and say, look what I can do. I can tolerate this. And then that somehow is seen to elevate your status. And when that's a prevalent concept, I don't think that we're looking at intervals as something that are really going to be super valuable or super helpful anymore for training, because it's now become dogmatic. It's about answering questions that have nothing to do with training. Question of, am I an athlete? Question of, am I initiated? Question of, how can I separate myself from the neophytes and show that I have something of status? And I think there's this, when we try to determine is somebody good or not, we look at the scaling of how complex is what they're doing and how intense is it. And we expect to see those things scale together. And the more complex and the more intense you see it, the more likely are you to see that as being competent. And I think even like the kudoing norms on Strava have changed, and I mean, personally, to be honest, I can't say that I particularly care, but, it's interesting to think about, has our concept, our kind of like Overton window of what is acceptable to give kudos to, something that's changed over time. Because I will go and do activities that, I'm like, I'll finish and I'll be like, that was awesome. I feel really good about that. And then it's funny, how that will get maybe a couple kudos from people. And then I'll do something that I think is kind of like stupid. And then that will get kudos, right? And I guess everybody has their own criteria. And some people, it's probably just mindlessly clicking that button. But our perception, right, of what are we rewarding, right? Well, that's an external reward. That's a response of other people, right? And on some level, are we going to kind of like be influenced to perceive certain things as more or less valuable based on the kind of social response that we get? But our attitudes about sport and training and what this stuff means and how we should engage with it, et cetera, that is something that we've learned. This isn't really native to us, except if you want to get to the level of kind of nuances of individual personality, which is not at all kind of where we're trying to go with this here. So I titled this episode Red, Yellow, Green for a reason. We think about that idea of earliest experience for sport. I think for me, the idea of being internally oriented, how like do I feel, and like how can I feel stronger and faster, and am I experiencing that sense of fitness? And I think that's something that was modeled for me. And so I think for a lot of us, right, we're learning right away from when we get exposed to sport. And I think that we're all learning something different though, right? So if you think about a traffic light, traffic lights work as a form of social communication because we all learn the same thing, to interpret this in the same way. And it's really important to interpret that correctly. Suppose that we all went to an intersection and some people got there earlier and happened to be able to drive through because that happened to be the timing of the traffic pattern. And then other people maybe sort of like squeaked through, and then the people at the back just sort of had a massive collision. And what if the way that we interpreted that was not to say that, well, you need to listen or to this understanding of, this is what the traffic light means. And, when it says yellow or red, that doesn't mean accelerate. It means you need to slow down, or you need to recognize you need to come to a stop. And only when it's green do you want to move forward, right? What if instead of communicating that, we just said, well, if you didn't get to go through the intersection, you need to try harder. You need to push more, right? You need to give more. And that's why you're not getting through that. So now what's happening is we're not learning how to interpret these signals correctly, right? We're going to learn something very different, right? And so these traffic signals are something that we take largely for granted because we're exposed to this very early on. And as a culture, we're really good at communicating about this stuff. And yes, there's some percentage of people who, obviously seem to take great satisfaction in defying every single reasonable traffic safety regulation there is. But, I think we kind of dismiss those people as the outliers of our driving community. But, we need that standardization and we need that ability to interpret, right? To make meaning of the experience. So with training, right, when we go to work out, we think of intervals as just kind of this absolute, but I think it actually makes more sense to think of training and doing intervals as a kind of a traffic signal, right? Where some people are getting signals or responses that, okay, it's green. This is good. You can go. This is what you want to be doing. Some people are getting the yellow signal that, hey, you know what, you need to slow down or else this is going to end badly. And then some people are getting the stop, right? They're getting the red light. But what do we learn here? I think that a lot of us are actually learning the opposite of what we should be learning. And that becomes our defined norm. And I think that goes back to the kind of performance aspect of performative performance athletes, where it's more important to be perceived as special and elite than it is to necessarily actually cultivate that, where it's like, it doesn't matter how like fit or strong you actually are, as long as you're getting the kind of social recognition, as long as you're achieving the badge value, if you will, of being elite, then but you are elite, right? And that concept of what am I actually learning to do is irrelevant. And so that will model and reinforce a certain idea of, interval training, for example. And I think what happens is that this starts to perpetuate the norm that it's all about pushing yourself. And the more resistance that you're experiencing, the more you want to push yourself. And intervals become this platform by which I think a small group of people learn by accident, to train, because they just happen to be coming through that process with the green light. The coach is setting a standard or a norm of intensity for the session. For them, it happens to line up with their sort of already established kind of aerobic capacity. And they're able to do that, and they're able to green light their way through that. And then they go to the races and they can race hard. They can accelerate, they can attack on the bike, they can maintain their hit and maintain a target tempo or pace in the run, right? Their swim feels, powerful, et cetera, et cetera. But then other people, like when they're getting that yellow light or that red light, and if they're, experiencing that resistance internally, they're being told that, no, that's green. So you have a group of people that's being told green is green. You have a group of people being told that yellow is green. And then you have a group of people that's just like absolutely imploding, and they're being told that red is green. So now everybody just sort of looks at intervals as the green light. And that idea is like, well, and I think this works on another level, frankly, because I think it's become this norm where it's like, it's the green light because intervals, that's actually what's going to move you forward the most. And, people get really fixated on that. And, because scaled complexity and scaled intensity also means proportional depreciation in the number of people who can actually execute it. So that scarcity of performance is there. And so for some reason, when we see less people being successful, in athletics, we assume that, well, their practices must be the right practices. And we look for those, that it's that weird outlier bias kind of thing that we've discussed this on other episodes. But that initial teaching sticks with us. And so we're all talking about intervals, and we all think we're talking about the same thing, and we're all experiencing it the same thing. So if you take that idea of the red light, yellow light, green light athletes, they're all doing the intervals. They're all talking about how hard they are. So they're all learning to interpret intervals as hard, and then the effort that they're executing in the intervals is hard. But they're not all actually doing the same effort, okay? And it's actually the faster athletes that are doing less effort. You can run fast and hard and still be in that green light zone. And then you can, actually look really incompetent and be struggling and just absolutely out of gas because what you've been set up to do is not appropriate for the kind of practice you need to be doing to improve. But there's no differentiation around that. Now, I'm generalizing. I think that there are some coaches and some environments where that differentiation does happen, but I think for the majority of people, that's not the case. And I think as an athletic culture, as participation in athletics is changing, especially around this sort of increased emphasis on I want to identify as being an athlete. I feel like, for example, being an NCAA athlete has sort of more and more reached this point of it's almost like this like class level divide in society. It's kind of messed up, honestly. The point where I feel like it's rude to say that, well, I myself was an NCAA athlete, because it seems like you're trying to flex on people with this kind of badge value of this thing. And it's like, no, that just happens to be true. That happens to be my experience, but I don't want to talk about that anymore in social context because of the way it has this value of like, well, you're trying to draw attention to yourself or self-promote. So you can't, unless you want to do that, right? It's like, okay, you have to think twice about talking about those things. And so the way that we're reinforcing this evolving sports culture is we're reinforcing this sort of like undynamic way of thinking about this stuff. And we're modeling and celebrating this kind of like, wow, these green lights, right? These high performers, people who just go and improve year to year and get all the cool results and the accolades. That's just awesome, right? And that the rest of us, well, we need to develop the ability to push into that, to push against that. And the intervals are where we traditionally see that, the men separated from the boys, the wheat from the chaff, the alphas from the betas, et cetera, right? And we have lots of language around this stuff for a reason. But like pushing yourself doesn't work. Those athletes who are green lighting this stuff are doing it because it's within a functionally fractional utilization of their aerobic abilities. And for the other athletes, it's not. And so they're not getting anywhere and they're not progressing. Certainly for my part, what I learned was, basically intervals were just like going into absolute failure on every rep. And there really was no conversations about, well, how are you feeling? And when I coached cross country and track with high school athletes, that was something that I tried to, make a point of emphasis, was talking to them about how this stuff should feel, thinking about how, we should be learning about these kinds of intensities, trying to explain, like, what are we actually trying to do? How do you know if you're being productive or not? And try to make that kind of level of discernment and differentiation. But these first experiences, right, I think in general kind of establish this postulate of like, intensity dictates success. And if we're not hitting these targets, it's because we just logically must not be going hard enough. And as I'm sure a lot of people have, and I think some people maybe never break out of that mindset, but I certainly went through a period where I was like convinced that, there was something wrong basically with me because I couldn't execute the speeds or the paces that other people did. And I wanted to be competent and I wanted to do well. And, now what I understand is that I wasn't being given the opportunity to train aerobically. And if I happened to be, though, in a random sampling of athletes where I just happened to have the highest aerobic characteristic, I would have experienced different outcomes. And I don't mean that to say that I would have done some crazy, awesome, world level athletics performance, but it would have been a significantly different outcome, because that's what happens when you are actually able to train at the right intensity. But through these intervals, which is this highly performative thing, which it's about demonstrating how tough you are. And then that's the bias of the coach, or if you're, self-coach, right? You then have that duality of role. Like when you're designing stuff, you're designing in that expectation that people will demonstrate their ability to be mentally tough, right? And that the tougher they are, the better they'll do. And I went into a cross-country locker room that had Prefontaine quotes all around the rectangle of the space over the top of the lockers, right? And that certainly encouraged a very specific, narrow mindset, right? And it was not something that ever suggested that, okay, is the reason why I'm struggling because I'm trying too hard, right? Like if you're drowning, thrashing around isn't going to help, right? You need to find some sort of an equilibrium, and an ability to recognize, right, red light, yellow light, green light. And I think then that what you start to learn, is if this is the method by which you're learning what it should feel like, you're being given an answer through the intervals in terms of what your ability is. And for a lot of us, we're learning that the slower we are, the less mental capacity we have, and that in a sense, we are then lesser than those people who can go harder. And that's how it's described to us, right? Is that they are not, it's not just that they're going faster, they're also able to go harder, because in order to go faster, you have to be willing to go harder. And, one of my brothers spent a lot of time in high school just really trying to go out and trying to, teach himself to go harder, because that was, the presumed answer to that. Now, I'm actually not saying that, everybody should be equivalent in athletics and there shouldn't be any kind of hierarchy and, we should run without finishing times, blah, blah, blah. I don't have a problem with that. I think the competitiveness of the sport is not the issue. What I'm saying is that there's a failure at the level of teaching and learning that's represented by this. I think it's a clear failure of coaches to teach athletes properly. It's definitely a fire and forget of, you look up the workouts and, you can go, and the internet again makes it easier to be ignorant. One of the ironies, because you can find cheap information or really cheap garbage masquerading as information. I think a lot of it shouldn't even qualify as information. But, you can look this stuff up. Well, these are the workouts for athletes to run such and such. And then there's no thought or consideration. There's no like actual observation of, how the athletes are going. And that's, not the rule, but that's the norm. Okay. And the fact that it's a norm means most people are subjected to this. And even look at like software, training software, the rise of like internet programs for training on the bike, for example, and something like Trainer Road or Zwift workouts. I mean, they're basically totally useless because again, it's this, everything's a green light, and the harder it is, that's good. You got to learn, you got to get better at it. And the answer again is that's incorrect. If you want to get better at this stuff, you need to have more differentiation about the intensity. And then as a consequence, you have people who love intervals, you have people who are ambiguous about intervals, and you have people who hate intervals and just kind of like give up on, serious exercise and fitness because it's not working for them, because the intensity that they learned is wrong. And I say this as somebody who struggled with, intervals in training for probably 20 years. So, I mean, for me, this is a very real experience. And I think it's kind of ironic because in actuality, a lot of the best performing athletes, especially with running, for example, that I've been on teams with, sort of generally met the standards of slackers. They did very little, or they tried to do very little, or they would lay off in workouts, or they'd whine and complain to get out of things, or they'd go really slow. I mean, there were some pretty serious drug users on the team in college who also happened to sometimes be really good at running the 800, very nice guys who happen to also do a lot of recreational drugs. And you wouldn't think that, oh, that's a formula for success. But, if you wanted to get, maybe overly interpretive, could you argue that they're kind of like hedonistic mindset of, hey man, I want to feel good. Did that sort of encourage them to be like, well, okay, we did these intervals and now let's just, sort of double, jog, fake jog laps around the indoor track and play catch with a tennis ball. Well, the rest of us suckers were like, oh yeah, we got to get out there and go for it. And, those were the guys who went out and really had the best racing. Where the rest of us, I think they were just kind of green lighting it. And the rest of us were kind of like, okay, there's a red light. I better step on the gas. And, like for my part, it didn't seem to matter how hard I trained. It didn't seem to yield better results. Like if there, for example, if there was a blizzard, I went to college in Maine. If there was a blizzard, I would rush to the gym and get my stuff on and go run 10 miles in the storm. before the coach could send out the inevitable email telling us to just, run around the indoor track for 40 minutes because of the storm. It was like, no, I'm going to get out there. And I remember one day I went out, I sprained my ankle as I was leaving the parking lot because I slipped. And then I got up and I just kept running and ran 9 miles on the ankle and then came back. And that didn't yield anything, right? I mean, there's all kinds of red lights there. Now, I actually don't think it is inherently bad to run in the snow. I think that it's actually fine, but I think it's more so to the point of cultivating that mentality is not something that's going to be rewarded, right? And I didn't learn how to differentiate, and I just saw, the greater the resistance, the greater I needed to resist. And I think that, and that's an example of, a training run, but like in intervals, I never questioned, are the intervals too hard? I just questioned myself, I'm too soft. I can't do this. And I think that, as a consequence, you take this concept of the interval, this overwhelmingly influential factor that is probably one of the more common sort of intersport, training components. And I think that you recognize that this is actually a super complicated thing. And I think the silencing effect around intervals, because if you've listened to enough episodes of the podcast, you know that one of my kind of overarching interpretations or suggestions is that, there's a series of kind of broad silencing effects where some of the phenomena that we might want to think about, engage with, reflect on, are kind of like the things that, we find that there's the most kind of like Orwellian control over, where we have ways to shut people down from talking about it. And I refer to those as silencing effects. And I think the silencing effect about intervals is to be like, nope, it's no more complicated than what's written on the paper. And then you just have to go out and do it. And either you can do it or you can't. And that's it. And there's nothing else to discuss. And that the act of discussing it is a sign of weakness. And again, the whole performance of performative athletic culture, blah, blah, blah. But that's really about, sending the right messages through what you do. And one of those messages is it's not acceptable to question this stuff, because then that's a form of making excuses. And I think not asking questions is actually a form of ignorance. And you can't progress if you don't ask questions. So let's try to maybe unpack to repack the concept of an interval. And I think actually, if you really think about it in sort of isolation from this social context, I think what you can realize is that intervals are very different from what people think they are. And they also actually are very simple. So let's start with the simple. I think the simplest definition is to say that intervals is the concept that there are periods of work and that there will necessarily be periods of non-work. Now, all training is interval training. And I'm not saying this to be obnoxious, but it's true, right? Because like you don't pick up a sport and then just continuously do that sport nonstop until you decide you are permanently done with that sport, because that would be the only context in which really it's not interval training. Now, in terms of sports culture, we've taken intervals to mean, a series of work periods of a higher level of intensity with a period of some sort of rest or recovery in between. And that you go a little bit further, and that the sort of implication, either stated explicitly or just sort of implied through the design, is that the intensity is something that cannot be sustained for the total work duration of the interval session without those recoveries. Okay. And that is really important to understand, because this is part of the reason why intervals have lent themselves to this idea of like testing ourselves and measuring ourselves. And so I think that's another simple definition of intervals as well is that intervals are a means by which people can try to quantify, evaluate, and sort of more easily compare their fitness over time. And over a big enough time scale and big enough time sample, I think that would be valid. But a lot of times we're looking at this on a very short time scale because, as people, the scales on which fitness change are much different. As I've said before, the secret is there is no secret. You just kind of have to figure out, a routine that works, a routine that you can sustain. Are you feeling strong? And chances are, if you're feeling strong and you do things that are a little bit challenging but not overwhelming, you're going to get better. But, if you go back again to the red light, yellow light, green light phenomena, right, it becomes tricky because how do we know if we're there? And then people sort of actually start looking for yellow light and even red light intensity in their intervals. So you see how we go from the definition and then we begin to spiral downward quite quickly. And then the next thing you know, you're back in that, original mode of now you're performing workouts and training for reasons that have really moved very far away from what's actually within your sort of proficient level of practice, to bring up another concept from previous episodes on the podcast. So I think the ability to measure is good. And I think that's a good value of interval training, right? The ability to see what you're doing over time. We need to be able to see that. If we can find genuinely empirical insights that actually tie to the ability to determine if we're improving, that's a good thing. We want to know that, we want to collect that. But like the expression of self-measurement, if you will, is not the same thing as good practice. And these intervals, the design of them very easily encourages us to push ourselves to the maximum. And, this is where if you're on a team, right, oftentimes the coach will think that, coaching motivation comes into play here in a major way, because a lot of coaches think that it's about being a motivator, and that's based on the belief that, people don't want to do well. But the reason why we think motivation is so important is because of that green light illusion. And it's, these people aren't actually doing what you think they should be able to do because you have set unrealistic expectations. And that if you found the intensity for the, less speedy athletes in your training group on your team, and that was, equivalent to the demand you're placing on the top athlete, you would find a similar level of engagement, because in these team environments, overwhelmingly people have already self-selected to be there. And most people want very badly to get better. And it's you're exploiting and manipulating their desire to do better. And as a coach, you're gaslighting them without realizing it, maybe, into thinking that they're inadequate and they're not tough enough. And that's really detrimental. And, because it works against the ultimate goal of creating a high performing group. And, it also works against, I think, what is also an important goal of, having a positive impact on people through sport, right? That it should be, I guess it's not supposed to be anything per se, but it should be, and it can be something that really adds to people's experience, and their sense of self. But when we teach people they're not tough enough, we're taking away from that. And, so the intervals, through the way in which we learn about them, encourage us to push ourselves to the maximum. And, when we do that, we exceed the threshold of proficiency in practice. I remember being sent over to, there was this bird sanctuary in Lewiston, Thorncrag Bird Sanctuary or whatever, and there was one path that sort of went from the parking lot and kind of went more or less straight all the way up to the summit, where there was a pretty infamous large rock there. And I remember being sent over there. I don't remember the context exactly why, but being sent over there by myself, by Coach Fresh, to do a session where I had to go up and down this hill a bunch of times. And it was kind of interesting because it was a hill, and I have no recollection of how long it is or how fast I did these. I don't know, maybe it was probably between 2 and 3 minutes, I would guess, of running. But, we would go and I would do this effort, and whatever, maybe did probably 6 to 10, somewhere in that range. And I finished and I felt good. And I had probably, in hindsight, I recognized that was probably like a green lighted workout. And, so I went and reported back to coach, and I was shown kind of some of the spreadsheets, which basically I ended up walking away from that being like, oh, okay, so I suck. Because, by whatever the times or the expectation, then for Coach Fresh, it was Franklin Park equivalent. So it was, well, based on this workout, this is equivalent to this at Franklin Park and blah, blah, blah. And I think what, I would suggest maybe was more important to be like, okay, you went out and you did this workout, you felt controlled and you did well the whole way. That's the kind of training that's going to allow you to get better. Who cares what the current Franklin Park equivalent of it is? I'm at the level that I'm at. It's, I'm not going to suddenly transcend by going out and exhibiting some capacity in a workout. But I think there is that sense of, why aren't you motivated enough to run hard enough to do well? And so examples of all of these missed learning opportunities. And I think it would be extremely unkind to blame the coach, because I think it's the culture of the sport, and I think in general, most of us operate in that kind of a paradigm because that's what we've been taught. That's what we've learned. And so we perpetuate that because we've learned it. And I think that, intervals then become this dynamic where it's something that people really understand the least, and we take this concept of, well, it's simple. You just go out and it's just the workout and you do this. And when things are simple, it creates the illusion of understanding. And when people have the illusion of understanding, they tend to be the most confident in their decision making. And I think even if people maybe don't feel confident, if they see something that's simple, they're more likely to act with confidence. And this is the dynamic of how there's a significant difference, I believe, between the phenomena of belief versus understanding. Belief to me is very similar to ignorance. It's an unwillingness to take in new information. It's the belief. Trying not to use the word, but it's the conviction and the sort of sense of knowledge that there is no additional information that could be acquired. And, again, it recalls the Dunning-Kruger effect of the more incompetent people are, the more certain they are of their competence. The less knowledge we have, the more likely we are to feel confident. But understanding is a mindset that, okay, there's always more information to acquire. And of course, this means that whenever you deal with anything in athletics that has belief as a component, it's going to be way easier to exert social control or promote some conformity of thought. So I did this little experiment on the Instagram story the other day. I posted these 3 training weeks, and they're also up there in a post if you want to take a look at them. But there was a week A, a week B, and a week C. And week A, I just posted just doing training. You could think of it as running or cycling or swimming. I don't care. Doesn't matter. But training where it was just like 60 minutes, 30 minutes. And that was just it. There was just one block of time in the morning or the afternoon session. And then I posted a training week, week B, where every session was some sort of an interval breakdown. And then I posted a week C, where there were some days with intervals and then other days where the session was just continuous. And I asked, what do people think is the best training week? And the majority of people picked week C. And I think that is an example of the kind of selection bias that really influences this stuff, is we perceive things to be the most valuable or most productive because we've just kind of been told, or they've been presented to us, or that was our experience, and that we don't really know why. Now, some people pick the other ones, and I don't want to overly speculate on why that is, but to my mind, the week that people would pick is the week that would make sense. The least picked week was the week that was, I believe, was the week with all of the intervals, right? And I think that has to do with people's perceptions of intensity, that if you present somebody with a week and say this, everything you're going to do is intervals, people say, oh my goodness, intervals are hard. That's so hard, right? And so then if you present something that's just, continuous blocks of exercise, People will be like, okay, well, that's easy, but that's not going to make you fast. And there's this perception of, okay, well, I need to have blocks of continuous activity, and then I need to have intervals, and the combination of those things are what's valuable. And so this is based on what we think is the most productive, is the selection bias here, not what is the most productive. And I think it reflects that we don't know, because the reality is, and I'm going to explain this more, there is no difference from one week to the next. And I know that's hard to maybe wrap your head around, because you could look at that and say, but they're literally different. And what I would say to you is you can't actually conclude that. You don't know that. And that you're assuming there's this difference because of you think that there's this difference between a training episode, training activity session that is designed to be unbroken versus a training session or activity that has implied pauses of some kind in between periods of work. But all training is intervals, because that first week, that was intervals. There were like 2 intervals a day, and there were hours of rest in between, and then there was sleeping in between, and that was interval training. So it's all interval training. And I think one of the driving selection biases is the bias of speed, especially for runners, right? We look for that. We think that's a key limiter. We have this concept of speed is this thing, and how do I get fast, and how do I get the speed? And we don't really understand what speed is, most of us. We just talk about it. But I would invite you to go run as fast as you can for 100 meters, ride as hard as you can for 30 seconds, swim 25 yards as fast as you can, and take a look at what speed or power can you produce. And then ask yourself, is that really what's limiting you? Are you limited by your speed? And I think the answer is probably not. It's almost never the issue, but that's ironically where we're the most anxious. And, anytime I even think about speed, I always become a little bit like, oh man, I guess I don't have any speed. It's just in my brain, right? Have I lost my speed? Blah, 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 right? And I think it's just this thing that gets talked about and pushed out there. And it's associated with this thing that we must have, and that the only way we can attain it is through intervals. And I don't think that's true. So we have some basic logic reasoning strategies that we bring to perspective-based situations in general, like comparing week A to B to week C. And I think one strategy is what I want to call the Goldilocks strategy, where we're looking for what's the just right option. So what the other product of this little thought experiment, Instagram survey experiment is that it's a demonstration of opportunity cost. And there's an effect in economics behavior where the opportunity cost changes the value of the original option. And Dan Ariely, who's a economics professor at Duke, did this study where they asked people to rate the attractiveness of a person by presenting an image of the person and then a slightly sort of more warped, distortive, or basically uglier version of that person. And what they found is that the presence of the uglier person made people more likely to see the original option as more attractive. And that's what a lot of the value of our training is constructed on. Our training is constructed on that value of that alternative. And I think those sort of 3 things for most of us are kind of the only 3 possibilities. You can do no intervals. You could, in theory, do all intervals, or you can do a combination of those. And almost nobody is going to try to do all intervals, although for people who are really tuned into swimming, actually in swimming, all intervals is kind of a norm. When I did swim team, it's all we ever did. There was one practice that happened, and that was when I was a junior in high school, and I had convinced the coach a couple times to just let me design the workout. And so then I got to do that twice. And then the one time I said, we're just going to swim continuously for an hour. And that was the only time I've ever got in the pool, in, almost 10 years of doing competitive swimming. And it wasn't just a bunch of intervals on the whiteboard. And I'm not saying that's necessarily swimming training is bad or broken per se. I mean, obviously people swim well, right? Just it's hard to say that, well, in cycling training or running training people are in crisis. But at the same time, I think if you look at cycling training in the United States, it's really weird that Americans basically are not very good overall at cycling. And I feel that that's an evidence-based statement, because if you look at the level of performance on the international level, like, American athletes just don't get to that level. And I think it's more complicated and certainly than, this conversation about intervals. But I do think ultimately the way you train is the most important thing, because that's where your fitness comes from. And there's no performance without fitness. And maybe some cyclists just don't understand that. But so this selection problem, right? We're going to pick things based on what we think is the most effective, but we're suggesting that the way in which we reach that conclusion itself might be somewhat limited. And interval training has taken on the connotation of, because it's higher intensity, and it obviously has to be higher intensity, and it takes a higher level of skill, then there must be higher yield. But again, when you broaden that to perspective of all training is interval training, then what we really need to ask the question is really about what's the intensity, because the intensity is constantly variable in training. And a huge and hopefully obvious conclusion at this point is that, well, that's going to be very subjective. Again, go back to the red, yellow, green light example, right? Different people can be assigned the same intervals, and the coach or the athlete might not be knowledgeable enough or skilled enough to correctly or just not understand enough to correctly determine that intensity. I did a hill repeat workout with Jillian the other day, and I should be at a disadvantage going uphill given my size, and we did 10 times this hill that was about 10% on a dirt road, and like maybe 0.35 of a mile, so a little over a third of a mile. And she just lit it up going into the first rep out of the saddle, and by and I was feeling pretty slugged out from the 17-mile run and ride I had done 2 days ago. But then by the fifth or sixth interval, I'm just rode right back up to her, and then rode right through her, and she couldn't hang, right? And she took that to red lighted it, and I went to my kind of green light concept of intensity, and it was just the difference was very clear, right? And her sense of urgency to get benefit from what she was doing motivated her to approach it in this way that was ultimately very unproductive. And just spent the whole time just kind of blowing up and struggling. Whereas for me, I had a good session, and I wasn't, and the first couple reps for me were relatively much 30 seconds slower, but then the last 7 reps were great. And for her, it was the first 3 reps were okay, and then the last 7 reps were all 30 seconds slower. And, that matters because we do want to find the right intensity, but the right intensity isn't the maximum intensity. She basically struck out with if I have an absolute gold star outing for myself, I'll be able to do this intensity. But even if you can, is that even the right intensity, right? I think that, again, you have to ask the right questions, and to ask the right questions, you have to have the right framework of knowledge to even recognize what those are. So when you look at this idea of if I really want to get the benefit today, I got to finally go get after it. And, I suggested afterwards, I said, I don't understand where this sudden sense of urgency is coming from, trying to set the tempo and push the pace on rides, and now, trying to be super aggressive in workouts. That's not how you've made the progression to where you are, such as that level is. If you progressed at all, it's because there were some good approaches, and it's not about upping the ante in terms of intensity. It's about actually training consistently in a way that you aren't, having breaks in your training. And that's where intervals become really problematic for people, is that a lot of times it leads to the breakdown in training, because people are adopting these intensities that are just too much. And you'll see stuff that encourages this norm, online, such and such miler does such and such workout, and they've got, they, right? The ambiguous they. But people create content now where they talk to high school runners, which I think is great. And then the high school runners get an opportunity to talk about how nasty their workouts are, and everybody gets to just be like, oh my God. Because I guess for some reason in some parts of running culture, doing nasty workouts is more important or more impressive than doing nasty races. Which I guess, like, if that's what you want to do, just kind of bring that sort of CrossFit idea of like, well, the workout is the performance, then you can do that, right? And maybe that needs to become a sport. There needs to be like an endurance athlete CrossFit thing where you, instead of going and doing racing, you just go and you do workouts, right? Maybe that's an unexplored niche that, there would be an audience for, because certainly people love to fawn and just sit around and just be so awestruck by the crazy special workout splits that people can do. And then it's like, how long would you last? And it's like, who cares? That's not the right question. And I understand that for people out there, they're punching out these molds in their content, sweatshops because they're looking for interaction or engagement. That's fine. But we also want to recognize that doing this is also teaching people how to think, because you're exposing people to these. It becomes an understanding, right? If you put something out there, it becomes a way to think. And, I think that, we need to be mindful of, how we're promoting, dialogue and perception around this stuff. And I think it's okay if people don't care about what people learn about this stuff. But I would nonetheless make the observation that this is a part of the reason why, something like intervals has become so convoluted and problematic, despite what I'm also suggesting is its essential simplicity. Because these time periods of work or distances, but 30 seconds or 5 minutes or 60 minutes, what do you do with that, right? Most of us are going to conclude that it should be something different. And that's not necessarily a wrong conclusion per se, but why do we reach that conclusion? Well, as an athlete, we project certain concepts of work when we see these numbers. And a simple iteration of that is to say, pacing value, right? How much can we do? How fast can we go during that time? And then we also have the associative value of sessions. I saw something, 8 by 400 for the mile, name a better workout. And just saying that makes me throw up in my own mouth. But, historically, this is like the world record brain approach. So Bannister did X, so that must be good. So that's what I need to do. Well, guess what? There's probably now close to 2,000 sub 4 minute milers. And I'm getting that number because, when I tried to quickly look this up, it looks like in 2021, there were about 1,664. So you got to figure now that's probably getting pretty close to 2,000. But being disproportionately influenced by the OG 4 minute miler is probably a little bit foolish. And then it, feeds in again to these ideas of, well, to see how good I am, I need to set a PR in the workout. And that intervals are designed for us to do the maximum intensity within that framework. And that, like, the unspoken language of the interval is if you're doing 5 times 30 seconds, you should go as hard as you can. And then, really, if you're a man, you take it with 60 seconds rest or 30 seconds rest. And then it's like not even thinking about the purpose of the recovery, but you just want to performatively take as little recovery as possible so you can show people that you're a friggin' baller. And again, right, if you want to be my workouts are my performance, I guess people can do that. But I think most people are doing this stuff because they think it's going to lead to an improvement in racing. So it can be like that. Training can be whatever you want. You can also train for the mile by eating pieces of chalk while riding a unicycle. Knock yourself out, okay? That's probably still better than sitting on a couch all day to train for the mile, right? But like, what's actually effective? And that's where we want to go in our thinking about interval training, is if interval training kind of has this like problematic identity, this kind of paradoxical state of like complexity through its simplicity. It has all of this like cultural weight around the ways in which we signify and express values that we want to be associated about us as athletes. What should we actually be doing? And the next part of this series of episodes, that's what we're going to move into. We're going to talk about how do you use intervals correctly, and that if you take the definition of intervals as periods of work, what can the concept of using different lengths of work in training help us to accomplish? Thanks for checking out today's episode of Black Cats Run. If you've enjoyed this or other episodes, feel free to recommend the podcast to somebody you know who would also enjoy this kind of discussion. You can check us out on our Instagram at Black Cats Run. We'll catch you next time.